mind who has some level of operational experience that has now, I've become an academic. And you know, it gives me a pretty unique perspective, and if you ever get to sit on a panel from me, you'll get to hear all the whining that I do about that. And I couldn't help but resist the thing after that last talk when I saw that guy cursing at the intersection. I don't know what that's normal behavior in Boston. I mean, that is abnormal? Okay. I'm doing the right click, Alfred, but it's not working. Okay. So my area of research is human supervisory control, which is not really the typical topic that we've been hearing about today. It's a little bit more applied, but I think that you will see that there are many connections between some of the neuroscience aspects that we've been talking about today and this idea of supervisory control. Supervisory control happens when you've got a person trying to do a task like fly a UAV, and I try to be very Army-centric in this talk, and this is a shadow UAV that we've been working with the Army on. And the operator does this through some controls and displays. There's a computer that somewhere sits in the middle that actually commands the actuators and sensors that actually fly the vehicle. So the human is doing a task but moderated by the computer in the middle. All commercial airlines fly this way. All military aircraft fly this way. Cars are starting to drive this way. We're now seeing active radar tracking in the cruise control settings now in cars. So supervisory control is starting to become more and more a part of our daily lives. Now, this is where my laboratory, the Humans in Automation Lab, we sit out on here. And at MIT, I work directly with a lot of the guys who build these systems. In fact, you know, that's one of my mantras is you can't do this without working with these guys, and they both need to understand each other. And yes, there is a joke, a little joke in the name of my lab, but you have to be a certain age to get it. I find my own students don't get the little joke, but you know, so for the cadets back there, you can ask some of the older people in the room later what the joke is. All right, now we specifically focus in complex time-pressured high-risk domains equals command and control. All of these systems require embedded autonomy. We look at individuals and small teams. And as a consequence of this, when we start asking people to do these tasks, for command and control settings, most of the research that you see is looking at what happens under high workload conditions for very good reason. But as we're going to talk about more today, one of the issues is, and most of you who've been in the military know, you know, it's like hurry up and wait, and then it's 90% of time just waiting around for something to happen, and then 10% sheer chaos and nobody knows what's going on. All right, Alfred, can we advance? All right, so just some examples so you can get grounded in what I'm talking about. Supervisory control applications include process control, nuclear plants. We do work in the design of the stations, manned aviation, satellite operations. NASA, you know, I love to hate NASA because they're mission control. If we think we're ever going to go to Mars, any long-term missions, you cannot have this umbilical cord of mission control anymore. Underwater vehicles, unmanned vehicles, air vehicles, this is the Shadow operating station, but even the ground vehicles that we're seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan and the JPL Mars rovers. These are all supervisory control. There's some intermittent, we're not doing manual operation or teleoperation. We are commanding these things, and what this means is that it requires higher level cognitive thinking as opposed to what we call skill-based tasks that you execute in very well-rehearsed settings. Some unusual applications that I think people find interesting about supervisory control, mining, underground mining. This is becoming a big deal. These are very hostile settings, right? So if we could actually start sending down robots down into mines to execute some of these tasks, we could actually help prevent some of the deaths. We're working on a very interesting project. And if you ever want to come up and visit me at MIT, I'll take you down to our robotic forklift. This is an Army-sponsored project. We're basically making these robotic forklifts that basically can run around and do all the logistics, controlled from basically an aircraft, like an aircraft control tower, where you kind of sit down on the field and these little robots are all running around. And even places, I just gave a talk last summer at John Deere. Turns out this supervisory control of tractors is really critical. We can't get enough manning. These are the same issues that the Army has. We have problems with manning. We have complex GPS-guided systems. Somehow we can bring it all together. All right, so now the specific topic that I'm going to talk about today is workload. Now, there are many different definitions of workload, and some of you who potentially are journal reviewers out there, I don't want to start getting into an argument over semantics. I'm just going to give you some definitions today, and if you want to argue with me about this, we can take this out to outside, because I stand between you and lunch, and I don't want to get into a long, extended argument over this. There is mental and physical workload. We can understand armies carrying these 100-pound packs. That is physical workload. But then when we ask these Army soldiers to look through reticle displays and start bringing up laptops and things that don't really require a lot of physical activity, they require a lot more mental activity. So we can actually measure mental versus physical workload. Now, on both of those metrics, we can actually look at subjective versus objective. How hard are you working, as opposed to how hard do you think you're working? And in a lot of the neuroscience applications, we see people measuring how hard people are working. We take heart rate, all kinds of measurements, and that gives us an objective measure of workload. But the research is pretty clear on this. How hard people think they're working is actually highly correlated to how hard you might have measured them on some kind of psychophysiologic scale. So that's kind of important, because when we talk about, all right, when we go out into the field and we do applied designs and whatnot, asking people how hard they're working is actually a pretty good measure. Now, when workload is basically how hard that you think that you're working. It's basically the dependent variable. Task load is the independent variable, which we potentially control. I recognize there's a difference, but sometimes I'll conflate the two. Forgive me. I'm a mother of an 18-month-old. I'm not getting any sleep. Now, there's actually one in the human factors research areas, this is one of the longest standing relationships that starts in 1908 with Yerkes and then later Yerkes Dodson, that did this research that said, we think that when people are under low to high levels of workload, they call it arousal. And it's really, and in fact, it really is related more in these early stages to physiologic research than really more the physical workload than maybe the mental workload. But this relationship has pretty much been extrapolated not just to arousal levels, but to performance over the last 100 years. In fact, it's kind of sad. We should have done a Yerkes Dodson 100-year celebration. I missed that last year. And of course, as a notional relationship, we agree that people work pretty well at some moderate level of workload. If they're stressed out too much, they start to fall off. But in fact, we see it quite a bit, that if people don't, if they're bored and complacent, then we actually can see problems with their performance as well. Now, the question is it really such a nicely symmetric parabola? Well, let me show you some results that we've seen over the years, some of the research that I've been doing. In this first graph here, we're looking at workload versus people's just general performance. This is a Navy Tactical Tomahawk research project that I did several years ago, where the Navy's question was, these are highly automated missiles. You actually, right now, you can type in a Latin long and you just press fire, and these things are like a wild dog in a meat locker. They're going to go right to that target. They're very accurate. In fact, the only times these have ever screwed up has been human error. Now with GPS technology, the Navy has decided that we can take these missiles that have about a 2-hour flight time and potentially retarget them in the middle of their flight. So what used to be a priori planning problem has now become a real-time supervisory control replanning problem. And the question was, how many of these missiles can one operator be expected to effectively guide through the course of this 2-hour mission? So we actually, these are results from 42 actual Tactical Tomahawk people. That's a whole other discussion about how hard it is to get real operators and the strings I had to pull and the beer I had to buy, but we got it. And so what you're seeing here is these were arrival times of events, meaning that every 4 minutes in this case, they had to retarget a missile. And then we increased the workload to 2 minutes. So every 2 minutes they were having to retarget a missile. And you can see the lines here. This is if they did 8, 12, and 16 missiles, 8, 12, and 16 missiles. Now, what's really interesting here is I take the Gestalt view and look at when we went to what we would say low workload to high workload, the 4 to 2 minutes. What did we see for the 8 and 12 missiles? We actually saw a nice increase in performance. And this is kind of reflective of Yerkes Dodson. In fact, 8 really wasn't enough to keep people busy. at a productive level, but 12, you know, they actually did better. But in both cases, when they were given 16 missiles, we saw a statistically significant and fairly dramatic drop-off. You know, it's almost like they hit that cliff of cognitive saturation. So, you know, we thought we were onto something here. And so a few years later, I was working on the DARPA JCAT program. And this was actually funded through Boeing at the time. These are unmanned combat aerial vehicles that could carry bombs and all kinds of weaponry. And so we built a simulation to look at that. And then right here we did the low replanning and high replanning, kind of like we did here. And we were looking at, these are also performance scores. And then what you see here is, and this was, these were actually, instead of looking at actual how many numbers of vehicles, we were actually looking at the effects of different kinds of decision support. So basically more embedded autonomy. And what we saw here was that we saw, again, a rise and then a drop and then a rise and then a drop, except different than this experiment, the low replanning looked like it was the peak of their performance, and then it dropped off, but severely so in the case when we actually pushed them using those higher levels of automation. So, just to let you know, when we look at what do air traffic controllers, how many planes can an air traffic controller control? The FAA will not give you a number on that. Can anybody guess why? There could be, but the unions will not let them specify how many planes a person can control, because then it would dictate how many controllers you would need to hire, and they don't want that number. But actually, if you go back and look at the literature, and anecdotally, if you ask managers, they'll tell you in the en route sector, which is similar to these levels of automation, it's about 12 to 14 aircraft. So you know, in this case, you know, we had some evidence, but overall, this kind of just, you know, I just want you to stand back and look and say, well, you know, in two completely independent studies, we're actually still seeing these kinds of effects, that we have this rise in performance and a drop-off. And the question, of course, the million-dollar question is, well, when can I know is that drop-off going to happen? Now, I also want to introduce another parameter, and because this is something that we measure a lot in terms of, it's more of an engineering term that you'll hear instead of a human factors or a neuroscience term. It's this idea of utilization. Utilization is a systems engineering definition of how busy a system is. And so I've taken this term and adapted it to the human operator. And so what utilization is for any given task, for any given mission, how busy is that operator during the mission? So it's their percent busy time. Now, by busy, I mean that they've actually been tasked to do something. So if you want to equate this to what air traffic controllers do, an air traffic controller is only busy when they're doing something, when they're commanding a plane to change altitudes, for example. If they're just monitoring the screen, if they're in some kind of vigilance task, we're considering that not busy. And in fact, this research, I wasn't the first person to come up with this. This was in about the 70s, 80s. There were some, and this came out of the air traffic control research. Could we actually quantify when people had a task to engage in as opposed to not having a task to engage in? So in that Tomahawk study, we actually measured it. And what we saw was this curve, that as people start to reach this 50 to 60% utilization, they're about busy half the time, then they do pretty well. But then once they get to about 70%, they have this dramatic drop-off. And that's actually, I've drawn the line at where 70% is. In the 70s and 80s research in air traffic control, this 70% number was actually also found that if people are pushed beyond 70%, you can actually see a dramatic decrease in their performance. So we repeated these results here. In this crazy JCAT DARPA study where everything is flying and we're connected on the global information grid and everybody's talking to everybody else. I love this picture. This is probably the best deliverable I got out of that project. When we ran that experiment that I just showed you, we actually saw this same, we see this generally an ebb, and a peak, and then again at the 70% curve we start to see a drop-off again. So there's something to this 70% idea. So if there's something to this 70% idea, what can we do with that? Okay, so nice. These are all descriptive studies, and really you're just showing us how people performed, but what can we do with such an idea? So one of the things that we've been working on the last couple years at MIT is building models of operators. Now, I don't want to start getting into I don't want people to argue with me about whether we're doing cognitive models. We're really doing metacognitive models where we're modeling the operator here in link with the system. These are all for us, these are the unmanned vehicle systems. And this was a generic UXV simulator where we could have a person controlling heterogeneous sets of unmanned vehicles. Didn't really matter what they were. And we're using some queuing theory to model and a discrete event simulation that's built on that to model the capacity of a human operator. So one of the things that we see is that, okay, so, well, first of all, why is this useful? Why would we want to build a model of one operator controlling multiple unmanned vehicles? This is not being done right now. This is a futuristic system. But wouldn't it be nice to know in advance how many vehicles, just in general, a person could control? And that's going to be task-dependent, capability-dependent on the vehicle. The ground control station design, and all those variables are represented in this model. So we would like to be able to say to, for example, the Navy or the Army, if you want one operator to control 5 vehicles and they have X capabilities, they can only control this many. And so you're developing an unexpected system. And there are some other things that you can do with a model like this. I would refer you to my student is just graduating with his thesis is just about to come out. It's on lockdown by the MIT Intellectual Property Office right now because we're getting a patent on this. But I can definitely, if you're in the Navy, you can actually have the thesis because the Navy paid for this research. I know, right? So it should be released fairly soon. I think in the next month or so it'll be through the wickets. We like to use predictive models because they can actually help us do system planning and also error diagnosis in the system. But these are hard, and anybody who's done any kind of human supervisory control modeling or even cognitive modeling, which this crowd should be very familiar with, it is very hard. There is nothing harder than trying to do cognitive modeling because you're modeling what's going on in the head. And because we're modeling what's going on in the head, we have no clear observable states. Even with the best fMRIs or FNIRS or EEGs or whatever, we're just making big guesses about what's going on in the head. And so supervisory control models like this, we're making guesses too, but what we're saying is, well, we can't determine exactly what's going on in the head, but what we're going to tell you is, given what the operator is doing and given what the system is doing, then maybe we can, meaning performance of the operator and the system, coupled with potentially some workload predictions, we can actually make some predictions about where the whole system is going. So let me show you some of the results from that. So we just kind of took using some preliminary data from an independent data set, we took a stab that our Yerkes Dodson curve looked like this. Okay, now, I recognize this is not an inverted U, it is a U. For those of you who've been paying attention, it is upside down because what we're saying is now we've inverted the penalty. Instead of saying performance increases, we're actually saying the negative effects. So we modeled that as a U, and in fact, and then we ran an experiment and then showed in this, using this one of our simulation test bed, that in fact it did exist, very close to what we had said it did. And then what we did is, given that model that I just showed you, the queuing model, we said, okay, if we do not put this model, this parabolic model of what's happening to people's their performance as a function of workload, how well does our model predict real systems? And so what you see in the blue line is actually people actually controlling multiple vehicles with this simulated test bed. So it's all real data. The green line is how the model does if we do not include this parabolic relationship that accounts for operator workload and gives penalties, for example, when you start to go high in workload and when you go low in workload. And then what you see is that actually the model does much better at predicting real performance than does the model without. This is actually pretty significant. This is the first time that I'm aware of that anybody has actually taken the Yerkes Dodson notional curve, turned it into a quantitative relationship, plugged it into a model that's actually made real predictions that match the data. So we're pretty excited about it. Now, I know there are many naysayers out there. So before you start cutting me off at the knees with all your naysaying, let me naysay in advance of you. There is no question that for these real-time, high-risk systems that, you know, we are actually asking people to go into very dangerous systems, that we need some unambiguous metrics potentially for adaptive automation, right? Because this is the other thing. If we know people are under a lot of workload, wouldn't it be nice if we could adapt the system to either reduce their workload or increase their workload? And we're looking at a couple of different ways to do that in our lab. We're looking at ways that maybe automation can adapt and automatically change your workload, but there's some problems with that. But we're also working on a system that signals to a supervisor, hey, I think this person's under a lot of workload and is about to do bad or is doing bad, and you should take a look at that and step in. And I think that's going to be a really good way to potentially get some intermediate results. Now, so to do that, we absolutely need these real-time state estimations, which is what this kind of, so this model that I'm showing you before, right now it only gave post hoc predictions. Now, wouldn't it nice if we could actually do this in real time, so that as your people, for example, you've got a couple of operators in a shadow van and they're doing their thing, it would be nice if the command guy that's actually, you know, he's a little bit physically remote from those guys, wouldn't it get nice if he got notified that potentially something was happening in real time? So one of the things we're trying to look at is this 70%, is this really just a heuristic? I mean, that's what it is right now. It's just a heuristic. We're seeing a lot of experimental evidence that's looking at that, but I personally would like to dig in deeper and find out, you know, what's really at the lower levels of this 70% threshold for busy. And potentially, and engineers love this, if you can give somebody a number, if you can say, okay, every time you see that 0.7 flag that the operator might be too busy, because we recognize that there are individual differences, and this is why that kind of research is important here, because we have to recognize that just because at 70% I'm too busy doesn't mean that at 70% you're too busy. We also need to look at the transient versus steady state. This is one of the problems we saw in our experiment is, when should you start measuring that somebody's at some kind of, they've gotten some steady state utilization mode, and for things like predator operators where, you know, they sit around for 4 or 5 hours before they get some kind of event, that's going to be, it's going to be nothing but a transient phase. You're not ever going to be able to model steady state. And again, what are these correct performance metrics? All these performance metrics that you saw in these previous results were things like number of targets bombed and number of missiles successfully retargeted, and they're all very mission-centric. So the question is, are they always going to have to be context-dependent, or can you actually find some other metric that's a little bit more generalizable? And does task type affect the shape of the inverted U? You know, so it's nice that we're saying the inverted U, and it worked for us in this last experiment, but is there some other dimension of this curve or some change in the curve that we should be looking at? You know, and I've, you know, the curve could look like this. It could be bimodal. It could actually be significantly exponential. And one of the things that we're looking at right now in the lab is I actually think that these curves will change given the kind of, generally the task type. If it's a skill-based task, I think it's going to be more like this. But if it's a knowledge-based task, it actually may be more like this. Now, what do I mean by that? A skill-based task are these well-rehearsed tasks. Automaticity applies. You don't really have to think about them. A knowledge-based task is, I've got a plane that just, my 2 engines just went out because of birds. Where do I land, right? That's a perfect example of a knowledge-based task. All right, I think one more slide. So what are we specifically looking at in my lab right now? We've got a couple of different projects going on that are specifically looking at, does the inverted U hold for the visual search task? So where you saw me using the predictive model before, that was a knowledge-based task. And the inverted U held pretty well. But for a visual search task, which actually accounts for a significant part of what UAV operators do, regardless of what service you're in right now, they're really just doing the visual search task. So what we would like to do is look at what do we actually see when we start applying these same methods and principles to the visual search task, and obviously the relevance to ISR mission. Right here, you're actually seeing a Predator operating station, and as much as the Air Force doesn't want to admit it, you know, they're having a huge manning problem, right? And so if we could actually figure out how to offload more vehicles to one person, especially with all this dead time that they've got, that actually could be a good thing, which could come out of this kind of research. And the low end of the curve, these Predator operators. So I had are there any Air Force people in here before I really make somebody mad? I sent 2 of my students who are actually first lieutenants in the Air Force to hang out in a Predator trailer in Arizona with some Air National Guard guys. and they would go into the trailer, and the guy would have his feet up on the console right here. So he would not be sitting, his chair would be pushed back, feet up, reading the USA Today. And they would come in, he'd be like, oh, I'm really doing something. I'm really busy, right? And what's funny about that is, if anybody here who's actually been in any kind of real world environment where you're trying to do some kind of vigilance task, which is what predator operators, they just hang out in these trailers for 8, 12 hours just waiting for something to happen in most cases. Of course they're going to read the paper. That's what people do, because if they're that low end of the curve, they're going to find something to do to keep themselves on the higher end of the curve. It just may not be related to their job, which is why it causes negative performance. So we're actually running this very, very painful study this summer where we're going to have people be operators for hours and hours, and they're going to have like one thing to do an hour. And we're going to try to quantify that low end of the curve a little bit better so we can develop better predictive models for these low end relationships. And I think, Alfred, I think that's it.
We have time for several questions.
Oh, good.
So I'm curious, first of all, that's awesome. The Yerkes Dodson curve gets thrown up all the time.
Sure. Sure.
I'll stand up. So that's awesome, right? The Yerkes Dodson curve always gets thrown up without any explanation, and it's just, oh, right, this is how things should be. My question is, how do you think that curve would vary, not just with tasks, but with multiple variables? So would you get better reliability? Would you get a shift in the curve shape?
When you say multiple variables, what do you mean by multiple variables?
So for most of the tasks that we would look at, there's different figures of merit, whatever they may be. So you can pick one and get a U-shaped curve, but you might pick another and get a bimodal curve. But each one may tell you something different about the larger performance of the operator.
Yeah, so I think what the way to think about that in it is then how should you be measuring your workload / utilization, right? And we could actually do that. We could vary it. We could say, well, what if your workload was, we are just counting it by the time you're actually doing a pan zoom? Or what if we count workload every time you hear a message, right? Because we could argue that even if you're monitoring and you're just listening to radio traffic, that keeps you busy some % of the time. So we could actually vary that and start to do some finer tuning. It is one area. Who's got the microphone? Because I think who's got the talking stick gets to talk.
Yeah, this is very exciting. I actually enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for the data. Data is always nice. Right is always right. So what I'm fascinated by is you have identified in your research intermediate parameter that can actually reflect performance and this inverted U-curve by talking about occupancy, which is a terrific idea. In my mind, it is directly applicable to the questions of human performance, not limited to the tasks that you can operationalize, because one can say, is that the intermediary that can be assessed later on with physiological parameters? Because we don't know what's optimal physiologically, but we know that we want to optimize physiology toward tasks which not easily translatable, like in your specific case, in how many vehicles I control. So I need to optimize physiology, brain activity, hormonal milieu, whatever I want to optimize toward variable changes of task. But it seems to me that what you're suggesting, that this 70% utilization mechanism can be extended further on, and we can try to correlate actually physiological parameters, brain activity in particular regions, decision making, so on, with some kind of utilization effort curve rather than with the performance, because we don't know what's best. We cannot simulate the operational environment that we want to all with time, and then try to apply that further on to the operational environment. So it's a kind of intermediate predictor that is very useful. Becomes a little bit more complicated, and this is, I will take another half a second, is that when you take the stress response, for example, and biochemistry supports some of your notion. So the enzymatic function is the most dynamic when there is a 60–70% occupancy of the enzymes, right? We know the maintained. The problem with that is, for example, in stress hormones, there's two receptor sites. One receptor sites acts on that level when there is a low level of hormones. I'm talking about MR receptors, which are very sensitive, what we call high affinity, low capacity receptor. And they will have a curve in the low range of stress hormones. And then there is another receptor, which is a GR, which is a high capacity, low affinity, and they will have a next curve, which will occur as the stress hormone level increases. So actually, we need to build a successive number of curves vis-a-vis this utilization, and then summarize it, model that, because each one of them probably supports a different function. But I just wanted to say that I think that's a possibility of creating intermediate breakthroughs.
And that actually kind of, the whole reason I'm presenting this research to you today is to kind of inspire you to maybe, do things like that. Now that we've talked about that and we're starting to see some regularity in the results, many of you in this room could actually help me further this cause.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Beautiful presentation, Mary. The first slide with the 4 minutes and the 2 minutes, it was clear that when you hit, I think it was 16, it was both at the same level.
That's right.
What that says to me is that as these things are flying, the rate or the kinetic effect of when you have to fix is exceedingly short. And this gets to what I think Israel is talking about, the second low affinity, high affinity business. You're not really looking at a temporal dependent, you're looking at rate of change of time lapse.
Mm-hmm.
So that means if you don't make it within 5 seconds, you lose. And the 5 seconds, maybe if it, I should say, if you can deal with 12 missiles in 5 seconds, you win. If you have to go to 16, you're out of it. So the rate of decline is not really a function of the time lapse between them, but between the time decay when you have to make the decision or not.
I agree, but I just want to be clear and just make a caveat. We can't make any clear mathematical assertions of those rates because we weren't really studying that at the time. But absolutely, I definitely think rate of onset of that is actually a whole other area of this, and this goes back to the transient and steady state. If we actually see a spike in people's workload, which is really what happens in most military situations, we actually might end up seeing an observed spike in utilization that goes way up, and that may or may not lead to bad performance. And so again, this is why I'm saying, I need, not necessarily more funding, but more time to actually look at all these issues. All right, so who's next? Who wanted to talk? Martin.
The curves that you showed in the beginning, the 12,
yes,
the 4.
Those are between subjects.
So
pretty sure.
the question that I have, can you generate those within subject? And how stable would they be within subject? Because that gets to your second
let me
point.
go back. Oh, okay, the JCAT study was between subjects, and the Tomahawk study was within. So one was within and one was between. So, and it was counterbalanced and.
By the way, the Psychopharmacology Society did celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Yerkes Dodson.
Man, I wasn't invited.
You missed it.
I did. I feel kind of bad because, it's rare that something in human factors can last 100 years, 10 years, so. That's right. That's right. There are other hands being raised.
Only because I'm responsible to all of you for chow, and chow is getting cold right now. It's ready to be served. So if we could continue the discussion as we move off to lunch. Lunch will be in the same room where we had